Welcome to Friday with Friends. Today I have a dear friend, a relatively new friend, and another physical therapist who is actually sitting with me, which is such a treat to actually have an in-person podcast. So welcome, Jerry. This is Jerry Yoo.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on the show, Lara.
Yeah, Jerry had me in his podcast a couple of months ago. It was so fun. And so I'm equally excited to have you and hear more about you because I talked a lot about myself there. So let's start off. Since we're both PTs, I always like to know, like, how did your story begin with physical therapy? Like, how did you become interested and what was your path?
So it's a very interesting story. I was actually, like many of our colleagues who were interested in medicine, I wanted to become a neurosurgeon at the time.
Me too.
Did you really?
Yes.
Get out of here. That's so funny.
Yes. I actually answered that in a question when I was a senior.
Oh,
what do you want to be? I'm like, I have proof. I have video proof. I said that. Neurosurgeon,
Yeah, I majored in, at the time, was biopsychology, which was at Vassar, the only equivalent to like a neuroscience kind of thing. I was like all in. And then by senior year, I was kind of thinking, I'm not sure if I want to do this anymore. It's a long road ahead. And I happened to find out about physical therapy. And I was like, well, what is that? I didn't really know. And so I couldn't put it in the back of my mind. I was actually set on going to Boston for a PhD program in anatomy and physiology. So I was ready to go. And then it's funny how life kind of takes you through different turns. I ended up in California, long story short. And I just saw a job for a physical therapist. And I was like, well, let me just see what that's about. And I just fell in love with it. And I think what appealed to me most about it was I was working with these very high-level PTs at the time who had a great reputation in town for being able to help people not have to go through surgery. My first mentor, Gail, she was like the PT for beach volleyball. So I met all these cool guys, like, oh my God, this is so cool. And then my other mentor, David, he was in Santa Monica. And David was like the spine guy for PT. So he really took me under his wing. Gail did as well. I learned so much about the field that was amazing. And for me, being somebody who was very interested in health and wellness and being able to tie that fitness background into something that was actually going to help people medically as well was really, really appealing.
I love that. And I think that those mentors are so important to really give credit to because they really can, because we, I did what like we did. I went into a PT clinic and first volunteered and then worked as an aide. And you get to see what their life is like, how they're treating clients, how they're progressing clients, and kind of what their ethos is. And I think that if you are with a really special person, you want to do that because you see like they're lit up about it. They're excited about it. And that's how this field should be. And we'll get into like how that might have changed a little bit, but I totally agree. I think I'm lucky too that I had some really amazing mentors and I thought I want to do what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because of that my path towards physical therapy was carved. And so I gave up my dream to go to BU for that and I instead applied to physical therapy programs. Ended up at Columbia, so I went from the West Coast back to the East Coast and went to school there. And I think what was really cool, I also have a background in massage. I learned shiatsu while I was out there just because I was really interested in California, and that's the California thing to do. And by the way, that was my first exposure to yoga, and it was very humbling. We talked about Ashtanga before. Very, very humbling. So got into that. And what I found in graduate school was that my hands-on skills were definitely, I'd say, more advanced just because I had so many years of actually using that. And I think that helped me to become a really good manual therapist at the time. So that was the sort of pathway I was on. I then from there, from working at in the school setting I was actually in with working with kids with disabilities, which expanded my repertoire of who I wanted to treat. And then I ended up actually working in orthopedics afterwards for a number of years before opening up my own practice.
Wow. First of all, you're smart. I always love you. I just think that, and I think that's, you don't have to go to one of the top schools, whether it's college or grad school. But I do think that going to schools that have such strong foundations give you strong foundations.
Absolutely.
And then you get out into the world. And I think, one thing that PTs, it was really drilled into my head, PTs are meant to be critical thinkers.
Yes.
And I feel like when you have a lot of knowledge, both academic and experiential, and then also tools like you had with manual, it feeds that curiosity.
Yeah.
So you were, and I know that that's true, true for you. So how long were you practicing before you saw some maybe disappointment in that ability to be a critical thinker, or not being able to fulfill this desire to really look at the whole body, look at the whole system, and treat clients that way?
I'm so glad you brought that up, Lara. So it's like I'd worked for a number of years in a facility, and then I actually opened a practice with a partner at the time, early in the 2000s. And what happened there, I think just this drive to want to run a business really sort of took precedence over, and I still give great care, don't get me wrong, but I think being able to really take a look at the whole person didn't really come until, I'd say, much later in my practice, just because it wasn't what I was wanting anymore. It's like, hey, I do believe that, we can give a great service, but if it's at the expense of seeing 5 patients an hour, I don't think I'm into that anymore. So later on, after I left my partnership, I went and opened my own practice. And with Next Level Physio, we were like, we just want to do things a little differently. And so from that began my journey of like almost reigniting my passion for wanting to look at the human system as a whole, and treating people as from a whole person approach rather than just a symptomatic, basic care, short-term relief kind of thing, which is very apparent in a lot of the in-network clinics.
Yeah, so let's just differentiate between these two things for people who might not know. So one was you owned a clinic, and therefore you were at the mercy of getting reimbursed by insurances. Correct. To make sure your clinic could run. Yep. Therefore, you needed your PTs, including yourself if you were working, to see a certain number of people so you could get that reimbursement to be able to run the business.
Exactly.
And then you tried another business model, which is I'm not going to be beholden to insurances, so that I then don't have to see so many people, and I can actually really treat them. Absolutely. I can actually take care of them. And I think this is a big gap. And unfortunate, and it's so unfortunate is we were talking about this earlier, like a lot of us pay insurance, a lot of us pay thousands of dollars a year. Yeah. And then we go and something does happen, and say we're otherwise healthy and we got to go to the PT. And then it's like, okay, you're going to get 8 sessions. They're going to be paid for fully, and that's all you're going to get. And then after that, you have to pay 50% or whatever it is.
Exactly.
And that might be a pretty good insurance plan, by the way, as we know there's. And so, but for 8 sessions, if you're going to one like the clinic you were running before, you're coming in, and because the person who owns it has to keep it functioning, you're going to be one of 5 people that PT is seeing in an hour, which means you might be lucky enough to get 10 to 15 minutes of one-on-one private.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
For sure.
And so this is where the problem lies. Yeah. And I remember when I was in a clinical setting, this was just starting to happen. And I'm so glad I got out before it really became a problem, because I know I was working with people who I couldn't just leave them doing quad set because they were neurologically involved. And so it's like they needed hands-on. They needed an hour of me being with them, doing a variety of things. And it's painful as people who want to help people, who have been trained, who have been put in a lot of years, to then be subjugated to saying, you can only really do one-on-one care for 10 minutes. That's all you're going to be able to handle. And meanwhile, you're going to be panting because you're running around. So hopefully you're going to have the clarity of mind to be really efficient in those 10 minutes. It is not a system that's set up for success for either the patient or the PT.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because now you have all these private equity companies who've come into the picture, and obviously they are bottom line driven. And so they are also pushing for these bigger corporate mill practices to push the envelope and keep seeing more patients per hour, because they have to make their gains on this as well. And so now you have this very watered down version of PT. And unfortunately, that has actually been at the price of our professional credibility at times, where people are like, oh, PT, so like a little rub down, a little hot pack, a little ultrasound gel, and then some cookie cutter exercises from the sheet from 1970s. That's probably still in the same file cabinet. And so you have this, now you have this dichotomy of that type of PT. And I'd say we have our other types of PT where we're more cash-based, out of network. And yes, we are not the cheapest game in town, but I can guarantee you that results and outcomes are way better than, XYZ PT down the street that's seeing 5 patients an hour.
Well, and the fact that you've done both, I think you're probably, you can say,
Yes.
and by the way, getting off, going and doing it on your own,
Yeah.
you're doing that because you have the love for the field,
Yeah.
not the love for the money per se, right? Because we
Right.
both know that there's a big risk involved.
Yes.
And I think it's important for us to really talk about, for people, everybody listening who, number one, might have had not a great experience in PT and doesn't value it. We totally understand.
Yeah.
And that's too bad, because people who are going into this field, I think every single one of them is going into it because they want to help people.
For sure.
Number two, they've also spent a lot of time. This is not an easy field. It is hard. Getting into school is hard.
Yeah.
Being in school is challenging.
Yes.
And so getting out and doing something that honestly my 17-year-old could probably instruct you in it's dehumanizing in
It
a
really
way,
is,
right?
yeah.
Like here
After
we have
all
done
that.
all this stuff and
Yeah.
we're like, oh, it's just something that somebody could just teach you. And
Absolutely.
because I can't teach you well if I don't have the time to do it.
Exactly.
So anyway, all that is to say, we are really building up for this, not to knock PTs or the system, but to really be open that this is the situation in the United States right now.
Absolutely.
I know it's not that, we have international people who listen. This is not necessarily what you guys experience, but we experience it here. And like you mentioned, these bigger corporations, imagine, we see this all the time, like there's a drink, that everybody loves, and then Pepsi comes in and buys it, and they
Yeah.
now are owning it. So this is what is happening. And so we're getting less individualized care, and this is where we as individuals have a choice.
Yes.
And that might be that you need to pay more because your care deserves it. So can you explain a little bit between what you do and what traditional PT, how you used to do it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say I was probably in that same camp earlier on in my career, where it was like spot management, if you will, spot treatment. So, hey, come on in. Let's put the hot pack on, make you feel relaxed, do some hands-on stuff that we thought was going to be effective. And usually we help people, I'd say, more than 80% of the time. But for the people who really needed that extra attention, that other 20%, 25%, it was really hard to give that kind of care. And it was very frustrating for me, where like, I just need a little bit more time with you. Not because of any other reason, where I just need to really think about your case a little bit more, because there's something that's part of the picture that's being missed by everyone else outside. And thankfully, even as busy as I was, being dedicated as I was as a PT, that's the kind of stuff that will keep me up at night, right? Oh my God, you know what, Mr. Smith coming in with this thing, and what could it be? That kind of thing. And I think being conscientious, even despite the busyness, kind of raises level of frustration, where it's like, oh, I want to help them, but I'm time constrained, I can't. Or they're visit constrained because their insurance company only pays this much, and we can only see them for this many visits, like you said before. And so from that frustration, I was like, this is not sustainable as a model. And I think for me, moving on, part of it was actually, I just need to get out of this model and do something that's a little bit different. And so I'd say the first year or two transitioning out of it was a little bit challenging, as far as like being able to convince people that you can pay cash, it's okay. And I've gotten since then much better at selling our value per se, and not being sleazy about it, saying this is how we can help you, take it or leave it. It's you're the person suffering, and we love to help you out. And this is why we spend the time with you. This is why we problem solve together. Why we want to get into your life, and why we look at every aspect of your life, from how you sleep, what you're consuming, your hydration, your stress level, your emotional state, all these kinds of things, and how that kind of plays into the bigger picture of why you may be feeling this right now, and then tying that into, well, what is it that really is driving you to come here, and how can we get you back to that thing? Whatever that thing might be.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I love that so much. And I think as you're talking, I'm thinking I think the confusion for people is that this is a medical service.
Yeah.
And if they thought about it separately, like personal training,
Yeah.
right? They're not getting insurance for personal training.
No.
And yet this is personal training with the added benefit that we have a license for physical therapy. So
Yeah.
we're actually adding on the layer of real care.
Yes.
Unfortunately, insurance doesn't pay for the personal trainer, so therefore they're not going to pay for that kind of added benefit of looking at the entire entire system.
Right.
And I think for everybody listening, let's give an example. And you're going to talk a lot more about this because this is one of your specializations.
Sure.
But I'm thinking of a client I had who, and I've had several like this, who come in with Achilles tendonitis and has been to PT, run out of PT visits, still having pain, so eager to get back to running, and is like, Lara, will you work with me? Because I did PT, it helps a little bit, but I'm still not able to run.
Right.
And I went through like, what did you do? And it was the same thing. It was like some ultrasound there, some stretching for the calf, blah, blah, blah. Well, what I did is I looked at like, well, how is your ankle moving? How are your toes moving? How's your hip moving? Of course, her hip was not moving well at all, and so she's overcompensating. So the point is she could make it feel a little bit better by doing like a couple stretches for the calf, but we had to like peel it back and look at the entire chain and how she was running. And she said, oh, my PT discharged me. I ran out of insurance and said I could start running again, but I'm still in pain. And I'm like, you can start running again and you will be back here, if not worse. So you need to change some things overall. So that is, I think, like that to me was such a stark difference. And what I was able to do with her in just a few sessions was education that actually enabled her to get back to running. And now she's running even more mileage. But you specialize with runners and triathletes. So I'm sure you see this all the time.
Absolutely.
Tell me a little bit about how you got into that and how you're looking at it, which I'm sure is somewhat the same way, but even more.
Sure. My first exposure to running was probably in high school track. I was more sprinter at the time. And then I got into lacrosse, so I left running behind. But in college, I actually got into it just for fitness and wanting to do that. And it's funny, actually, Lara, because when I got to grad school, I was really into fitness my whole life. But when I got to grad school, I met this guy, another student. He was like, I do triathlons. And my only concept of triathlons was Ironman. So I was like, oh my gosh, that's right. And, these massive races. Like, no, actually, there's levels. Like, there's levels? There's sprint, there's Olympic. I was like, I didn't even know that. So me, being who I am, I just felt compelled to, I could try it. This guy can do it. Why can't I?
Right.
Most humbling experience of my life.
Oh, yeah.
I've
done one mini triathlon, and I was like, let me just not drown.
Exactly. And for me, there was a personal note. I actually almost drowned when I was in 6th grade, or actually 8th grade it was, in the ocean. Wow. And I had this panic sort of like associated with swimming. And my first race was sort of my way to get over it. And after that, I was just in love with the sport. I've continued to race in sprints and Olympic distance races. And we have a tri club that's actually associated with our practice too, our Next Level Tri Club. That's how we get into it. But what was really fascinating was really working with runners. And there's so much literature at the time, like growing into that was actually emerging from people like Chris Powers oh my God, I can't remember her name. I think it's Janine over at University of Delaware. This is about the time when the Chris McDougall book came out, Born to Run.
Born to Run. Oh yeah, my God. Yeah. Everybody's
classic.
Read that. Exactly. Every runner's read that.
But that was transformative for my own clinical practice, and I really got into sort of that forefoot, midfoot strike, and just diving into the research and seeing how much of that proximal chain, everything from top down, how that can influence an Achilles tendonitis, for example, really became very interesting to me, and also helped to open my eyes to like. Yeah, it's an Achilles issue, but like you said, there's a lot more going on if it's an Achilles issue. So I really got into reviewing gait mechanics, 2D, and then now we have a 3D system down in our Cary office in North Carolina. And so that's been really, really fascinating as far as being able to identify which runners are going to have which kinds of problems just based on how they land, on how their running form is, and being able to teach them the right skills because here's what we forget. A good friend of mine, Kevin Vandy, would say out in California, running is a skill. No one has been taught how to do it. And so as a result, you just do what you think is running. And that starts at a young age. And the problems that we see 20 years later oftentimes arise from the way that you're running based on how you thought running should be. And so when we make modifications just in how people run based on their gait analysis, there's a lot of benefit not only on how they feel physically, because a lot of them come with knee pain. And I know in your podcast before you mentioned that the knee is just the middle guy. You got to look above and below. So looking at the entire picture of how this person's running, being able to get them back to those things that they want to do just by modifying their running is amazing on one level. But the other thing is having them run faster than they ever have before. My one favorite testimonial, Chrissy, who was on our YouTube channel, she had run a 3:10 marathon to qualify for Boston, which is in a feat in and of itself.
Yeah. She
qualified for the year after, and she had a high hamstring issue, which a lot of runners have, a proximal hamstring strain. 3 months out, she didn't know what to do. So through word of mouth, she found us, and she found out that we specialize in running and triathletes. Came in, and the first thing we did was film her running. And she was like, nobody's ever done that before. It's like, no one's ever done that before. You're a runner. It's like, yeah, this is like the first thing. And then we got to look at shoes too and how your wear pattern is and identify these things that might be causing you to run the way you are. And although we didn't have our 3D technology then, we were able to identify there are a couple of sort of like gait abnormalities in how she was running and her landing mechanics. And so we corrected those, had her do very easy drills to work on those while she was healing. Then we added some of our technology stuff. So we used the blood flow restriction therapy from Owens, which is an amazing device if you want to ever accelerate recovery for any kind of surgery or malady down the chain or in the upper extremity as well. And from there, we got her feeling better. And then she had never done strength work before either. So good thing we're 3 months out, so we could actually do some stuff that actually have some benefit. So she got much better. And with Harry Pinot, who is our exercise physiologist on our team, we put together a program for her to be able to run the Boston Marathon after missing so much time training, and she PR'd.
Wow.
So 3:10 to a 2:54.
Wow.
Crazy.
That is some major time cutting. Wow.
And her biggest thing was like, and this is the whole thing with Next Level, is like, I don't care that you get back to running a 3:10. I want you running faster than you ever have before. Mm-hmm. And for her to like have almost like a 15-minute like PR was like mind-blowing for all of us. We're just like, oh my God. It's raging about it.
And she probably felt amazing.
She did, exactly.
Right.
Oh, here's the thing. She said, I felt like I had more in the tank after I was done, which is like, that is amazing.
So can you briefly explain, because I think it's so fascinating, this idea of like more in the tank, meaning like you're preserving your energy versus dissipating your energy.
Yes.
Right? So running, if someone is running and they feel tired, like it could be cardiovascular tired, but it could also be that you're just dissipating a lot of energy because your form isn't great.
Exactly. And then one of the biggest dissipators of force is that vertical oscillation. Like people run like a pogo. Yeah. You're just wasting energy going up and down versus forward. Yeah. The other part of it is the arm swing. So a lot of people have this sort of like cross body thing. So they're wasting energy in that plane of motion here, not directing them forward. And then they're not utilizing gravity. So if they're not having that sort of like 8 to 10 degree lean forward, you're not using your best friend, which is like the easiest way to get free energy, just a slight lean forward.
Yes.
And just by taking a look at these different things, and again, having them build the stamina to run differently and the motor patterns to run differently can help these people have the running economy that they need to be able to excel in their sport.
So why do you think the proximal hamstring injury occurs in runners?
I think a lot of heel strikers tend to get it. And so what happens is because of that extended leg over time, if they're not developing those muscles. Also, I think because of that pelvic orientation. So if they already have something going into this running and you're adding distance over time, and if the pelvis is not doing what it has to do and the glutes aren't working the way they should, that high hamstring is going to want to try to help out as much
Decelerate,
as possible. Decelerate, exactly. Yeah.
Oh
so
my
now
God.
you're
poor little guy. Because proximal hamstring injuries are common in yoga, but for a different reason.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Super common.
Wow.
In fact, Judith Lassiter, who is a PT who studied this, she said that 90% of the injuries are from yoga.
No way.
Yeah, and that's so because it's. I mean, we could go into. People have heard me talk about this ad nauseum, but there's a lot of forward folding, and it's that idea of like you're just going and gravity's helping you out, and then the hamstrings are like, whoa, Nelly, what are you doing? But because people like move their pelvis back or around posteriorly tilted or anteriorly, they're just doing something, but they don't have any control of the trunk moving with gravitational forces. So it's like over and over, and then they're put in like a position. There's a Well, you probably remember in Ashtanga. I mean, there's a lot of forward folds in Ashtanga, but people are going to try and do that in whatever way they can.
Yes.
And usually the ischial tuberosity is at the kind of bow point where it's getting pulled on a lot. But it's the same idea. Glutes are not usually strong.
Sure.
They're not controlling the pelvis, and the poor hamstrings are just trying.
Absolutely.
So I didn't realize that was common in running as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And especially our elite level runners, because they're just going at such a high intensity and velocity that they're going to put a lot more stress on that area. It's funny you mentioned about yoga because with the way that pelvic orients, if the glutes they aren't sufficient to help hold that back, for sure, I can see how that can happen.
Yeah, and there's a lot of weak glutes out there.
I was going to ask.
As we know, I mean, everywhere, not just yogis.
Yes,
everybody is
general,
probably functionally not. Yeah, like we're sitting on them a lot. They're just like, I don't have much to do here. Yeah.
The other thing I was, and I think you mentioned this before in a conversation where I think a majority of people who do yoga are females.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And we know from the research on ACLs that women tend to have a weaker hamstring versus quads, and it's reverse in males. And I kind of wonder if that's also playing into the picture as well.
I think so. I think it's the carrying angle, the weakness of the glutes and posterior chain in general, and not stabilizing. And I think there's just the lateral hips, I think is the whole, like everything around the pelvis is not as stable. So, and I'm sure that they're just not managing that force. So, okay. So you have lots of runners. So runners should definitely look up Next Level Physio, but
thank you.
You also treat other people as well. So I think this is something, if I could like scream from the rooftops, I would rather you not go out to dinner and go and see somebody like Jerry because you deserve to feel your best. And what is part of, I think, our culture and understanding with insurance and healthcare is all that is you wait until something is wrong.
Yeah.
But I always say, hey, hopefully you're brushing your teeth every day and hopefully you're going to see the dentist and you're doing all of this preventative maintenance. You have to do this for your body because, like you said, we don't get a manual.
Yeah.
We don't get a manual for how we're supposed to lean over and pick up laundry. We don't get a manual for running. We don't get a manual for going to the gym and then deciding to add load because we want to build muscle. We might get somebody guiding us who is looking at the whole system, but most likely you're not going to get that. That's just the fact. That has to be somebody who is specifically trained to look at all of those things. And so I think going to somebody like Jerry, you have 4 clinics.
Yeah.
To me, this is where I would spend my money. I was talking beforehand with you, like I have insurance and I still spend money on going to a functional medicine doctor who is completely out of pocket.
Yeah.
I don't even like hesitate. And I've recommended her to so many people and 50% of them will say, oh, wow, that's expensive. I didn't know. And I know that they could spend that money, but they're choosing not to. That is everyone's choice. I'm not at all saying, you're right and I'm right and you're wrong. But this is your body. And we have the unfortunate but also knowledgeable experience to know like people who have had an injury will do anything, will spend any amount of money to not be in that state of pain, to not be in that state of dysfunction, disability, because again, these things can take away your livelihood, they can impact your lifestyle, etc. We don't want to look at the negative. Let's look at the positive. You have it in your hands to do something.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the preventative care stuff that you think, if I was somebody coming to you and I'm like, Jerry, I'm in pretty good shape, but I have this kind of nagging pain in my low back. It's not enough for me to go to the doctor, but what can you help me with? Yeah,
it's funny you say that. We actually, for everyone out there, we have our free total body assessment. And this is actually our gift to the community. We don't make any money on this. It's our way of like spreading value for what we do for the profession. And so people will come in, we will talk about the kinds of things that they're going through and do a head-to-toe quick examination to say, these are the things that we see identified as weak links or problem areas. If you're having this back or shoulder issue, where is it linking from? And then we talk about next steps on how we can actually provide even more value if you go to an evaluation. And just because you don't, I guess that's the misconception, right? People think that, I go to a physical therapist when I'm in pain. Yes. But a lot of times we're starting to get people, especially in the 30s and 40s, where myself included, where we're starting to notice these little knickknacks here that are, little aches and pains, and we're still wanting to be at the top of our game. So they're wanting to see, well, what else can I do to make sure that I can stay at that top of the game and not be compromised and be out of the picture. And in fact, one of our guys we're working with closely, he's the owner of Crush, which is a soccer team up in North Jersey. And one of the things we both gelled on was that he's still trying to crush it, like physically. Like he's doing CrossFit, he's doing all these great activities, and he was a high-level soccer player back in the day. And he just wants to continue to crush it moving for the next 30, 40 years. And I'm the same way. So we're like, oh my God, we're just kind of rallying together on that. And it's like, hey, listen, Yuli, there are a couple of things that I notice about the way you're walking. Let's take a couple pictures so I can show you what that looks like. And he was seeing all these different things. It's like, oh my God, I didn't know I had this issue. It's like, well, that's why you have this Achilles issue for so long. Your body's always leaning forward. So identifying these couple of things and then showing them a couple of tools they can do by themselves, I mean, that can just be like the biggest help right there. And hey, listen, take the tools. If I never see you again, awesome, great. If you happen to need me, because you might need me based on what I'm seeing, you know where to come.
I love that. And another thing you just said is really important, and I think people that listen to me long enough know, we don't know what we're doing. We really don't, because it's a habit. It's a hardwired thing. We might not know. Like, I had somebody here doing a private with me, and every time she lifted her arms, her toes would lift. And I was like, and I started looking, and I was like, oh, well, because she knows intellectually, because she's gone through my training, she shouldn't push her ribs out. But she's holding them back. But when she lifts her arms, that is still there. That she's lifting that, and she's lifting her toes because she kind of leans back. So I was like, plug your toes down. She's like, oh my gosh, I feel that so differently. She would never have known that, right? We all do things we don't know we're doing because they become so hardwired. So you need a professional to look at it and say, like, do you know when you're walking, this is happening a little bit? That might be there because that's the way your femur goes, but it might be that there's something else. So let's look at it. And I just think it's so important to really spend your money on yourself for today and the future. And if we don't know, even like, I'm a professional and I don't know necessarily what I'm doing all the time. I know a little bit because I follow myself so much and I'm so self-aware. Even so, I need like eyeballs on me. But this is where we need to spend our money. What do you think is the biggest hurdle for people to see the value of like what you're offering?
I think the commoditization of our field has devalued what we do. And it's sad because I feel bad for our colleagues out there who are still working these situations where they're seeing 4 or 5 patients an hour. It's not their fault. And it's not the fault of people making the choice to see them because they don't know any better. Like, if that's all you know, being PT and it's covered by insurance, and maybe you heard that this person was decent because that other person didn't know any better either. These are the kinds of things where I think the bottleneck becomes, where they can't see the value of going to a Next Level Physio or seeing you, Lara, for anything, because they're like, well, if it's more of the same, why am I going to pay more for it? Well, why pay more? I get it. And I think unless we start changing the perception of what we do, which is what we're trying to do through our social media channels and even through our total body assessment, give you a chance to see what physical therapy could be like. I think that if we have more people doing that and more people exposed to that, which is why we do it for free, like, just, I don't even care if you don't see me, just come in so you can see what the difference is. I think we're going to have the same issue over time and time again. At the same time, these corporate mill places have been good for my business because we've had patients go to these traditional practices where it's short-term relief, basic care, very symptom-based, like my Achilles hurts or my elbow hurts. And they come see us and like, wow, you guys really listen to what I say. You guys are really trying to think about what's going on with me. And you've asked me these questions about my whole lifestyle, which nobody has spent the time with me. And you filmed me, for crying out loud.
Right.
Like, who has that time to like take a look at how I run or how I squat or how I do a snatch, all these kinds of things. And because of that, they see the value in that and they say, this is where I need to be.
Yeah, I know. I understand the unfortunate, like, they've had something and then they had to compare to.
Exactly, yeah.
And sometimes that's what people need. But I just am going to preach it until I can't do it anymore, which is that we have to start valuing our health.
Yeah.
And that's in all the ways. And that's why I love what you do, is that you're looking at all of it. The function of your body is about how you move, but it's also about how you sleep, how you manage stress, how you are feeling about yourself, your mental health, all of it. And I just think that, and I'm sure your background, now that I know that you were in neuropsychology, I'm sure that comes into play, because we know how much, by the way, the brain and body and mental health and physical health are interrelated, and you cannot pick them apart.
That's absolutely true. And I think just that, having been in that pathway has led me to where I am right now. And even just, going back to mental health, just knowing how much of an impact we can have people and having, especially when they have chronic pain. And I'll say, and for anyone out there who has chronic pain, you might have come across different studies showing that one of the best antidotes is movement. And it can be the simplest movement. It can be, that can develop into something complex. But when you move, you will start feeling better. It's natural to feel afraid to move because you're afraid of getting hurt. And maybe you've tried things that have injured you before and you don't want to do that. But if you have a graded exposure to those things with the guidance of a professional or a coach who really has a good understanding of what you're going through, you're going to have a much better pathway to getting better rather than avoiding things, having that fear avoidant behavior, which only keeps you paralyzed, quote unquote, and not enjoying life, which feeds the cycle of mental health being less and then feeds your physical body feeling less optimized.
Yeah, and the stress response. I mean, you just increase your stress by.
Absolutely.
I mean, movement is something that's actually going to help you manage that.
Yeah.
But I love that you brought up chronic pain because I've had more chronic pain clients in the past year than I think I had in like the previous 10 years.
Yeah.
And so I do a lot based on my own experience and intuition, but I'm also always looking up research and stuff. And it's shocking how little is out there in terms of, or how how little there is that is really decipherable, I think, by the layperson. Mm-hmm. And so, first of all, can you just define what you think of as chronic pain?
Yeah.
And then what should people, besides moving, like I can think of the things I've told my people to not necessarily do because it's, again, a short-term fix. But what are some suggestions beyond like moving? Like what are some ways that people can start to feel better about treating their chronic pain?
Absolutely. I think the first step is actually being willing to and actually finding professionals who understand that chronic pain it's a long-term process. It's not going to happen overnight. So for you to get to a point where you're in chronic pain, which is usually after that first 2 months or so after an injury, if it's not getting much better, you're already in that chronic phase of that injury or whatever it might be. And that can lead to more kinds of pain because now you become hyper aware to those symptoms. And as a result, now you move even less. So I think the first thing, having willingness to get better. Second thing is finding the right professional to help you out there. And then 3, identifying the things in your life that are making you feel that way as well. Because there's a lot of emotional, mental factors that we talked about before. There's a lot of habits that we get involved in, whether it's the substances that we take, whether it's the sleep patterns that we have. If you're a poor sleeper, what's your sleep hygiene like? If you're not getting sleep, your body cannot recover. It's impossible. So these are all things that we ask in our questionnaire just because we want to find out like what is really the root cause of why you're still in pain. And then understanding that when you do start to move and address this, it ain't going to feel that good for a while. And we know that because your brain's like, oh man, your brain's on hyper alert now. There's that big sort of like sensory map that's occurred over time. And in order to reduce that map in the brain of that pain pattern, we have to actually extinguish it by doing things that don't feel that great.
Yeah, and I think in a way, chronic pain should almost be looked like as more of a brain thing than a body thing.
Yeah.
And what I was kind of alluding to, and this is, again, not to dismiss some use of this, but what I have seen in the people that have chronic pain, and I was thinking more chronic regional pain, but I've seen a lot of people with chronic pain, like 2 months. I've seen tons of those.
Yeah.
No matter what version, having somebody give you a shot for it is treating the body.
Yeah.
It's not treating the brain.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Okay, so again, I don't want to, if somebody's like, well, it was the only way I could function getting this shot, that's fine. But you then also that's just like helping you, like,
the Band-Aid.
It's a Band-Aid, it's a bridge. And the people that I saw, especially in this past year, but I've seen them a lot in, general body chronic pain, have tried all that, have gone and they're like, oh, I'm on my last cortisone shot, should I not have it? And I'm like, there's a reason there's a certain number.
Yeah.
And if somebody isn't educating you about all these other things, and with chronic pain, again, it is the brain has kind of been overloaded in its opinions that you shouldn't be doing something.
I like that.
Right. So I think in some ways, if you're experiencing pain, don't have it's so hard not to have like a really negative and hateful feeling toward that body part, and it's often not that body part.
Exactly.
It's just some other faulty wiring. And that's why you do need to go to a professional who's looking at the whole system.
Yeah.
Like, again, how you're handling stress, sometimes I've worked with people who can almost pinpoint when the pain started and there was a stress event in their life like 2 weeks before that. And it's just
Absolutely.
like, we don't know for certain that but it's just so, it's so suspect that it had something to do with this higher level of stress, and their, some way their body was like, okay, I'm going to hold on to tension and I'm going to express it as pain, but it's really the stress.
Exactly. Yeah. And, it's funny you mentioned the injections, and obviously everyone's heard about the opioid issue, and, we try to do things naturally, and we try to get people eventually off of those things because now they're feeling comfortable moving because they're more secure in the fact that they can get better, more confident. And that goes a long way as well. Like, oh, I don't know if I can do this because of whatever happened, whether it be an accident, trauma, what have you, injury. And once they see that they can, that already teaches the brain that, hey, I can do this. I can't do it the way I want to do it fully yet, but I'm on my way to get to that point. The other thing I wanted to mention as far as like people with chronic pain, just having the social support, that's really huge too. And we find that the patients who are in a lot of pain don't necessarily have that support. So it kind of goes along with what you were saying before about how different kinds of people, depending on how they deal with and address the pain, they may actually have sort of like an emotional event associated with that particular pain. If you don't have the social support around you to deal with that correctly, that might be something lingering for a while.
And then it becomes like this entity that you live with, like, I can't do that because of my low back pain. I can't, and then so you're limiting not only your movement experience, but like you said, maybe your social experience.
Yes.
So you create this barrier, and it grows. You're like feeding the beast, and it's. So I guess what we're trying to say is this is all natural, but it's not normal.
Yeah.
It's not. It's something that you can do something about. Yeah. Because I have had, and my next question is this. I've had people who are like, yeah, sure, you're in great shape. It's easy for you to say, I can barely, and there's like, they're angry. Yeah. And I get it. I mean, pain makes anybody angry.
Yeah.
And pain for long periods of time makes you feel angry. It makes you feel hopeless.
Yeah.
And then you really feel like you're in this camp, like, well, saying to me, like, you couldn't possibly understand because you're healthy and you're all this. How do you address that with someone?
I'm so glad you said that. And on different levels, I'll address it. I used to be really overweight too.
I can't imagine.
I know.
You guys can't see him, but he's like so trim and young. And I almost kicked him when he told me he was like close to my age. I thought he was like 20 years younger. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah. So I first share that story with people who either have weight issues. They're like, there's no way. It's like, no, I get it. And for me at the time, there's a lot of emotional eating with that, a lot of stress eating. And it was a way I could cope with certain things going on in my life at the time. But I still pushed forward to be able to get to the point where I am at now. And it takes a lot of discipline. And of course, there's still times when I'm like, oh, I just want to binge. But really, I just try to keep it under control with the activities that I do in my life and having the discipline of wanting to do that. That took a lot of time to get to. The other part of it is I've had my share of injuries as well. So when you can empathize with somebody and say, listen, I had a knee issue, I had an Achilles issue, my shoulder did pop out when I was younger. And that kind of gives that sort of like, oh, wow, so you're not just, you're doing all these things, but you really understand. It's like, I get it. And I can say, like, I get your frustration. If Lara, you're in front of me as a patient, it's like, listen, I totally get it. The mental frustration, because for me, exercise is a way to deal with stress. It also helps me to just kind of keep my nerves where they need to be because of my busy schedule as a business owner. And having these other outlets for myself. So I do understand that when you're not able to perform at your best, it can really send you on a downward spiral. And just by having that starting point with the client, you're like, wow, this is, so he gets me. And actually, all of our team members have had their fair share of injuries. So we all start at that level. This is where we're going to build trust with you. We get you. Our goal is to get you back to where you can get to a level that's way beyond what you can get to. And we want to be part of that process with you because we want to see you succeed.
I love that.
Yeah.
So I had a thought and then it just left me, but it was like, oh my gosh, I was listening to him and I'm like, wait, I got to pin that. I'll come back to it. It'll come because it was really good. I guess what I was thinking is if you have someone who is in pain, not necessarily convinced, and kind of thinks that this is, their genetics. Their mom had this, their dad had this. This is, I'm never going to be able to lose the weight. There's a lot that goes into, I know what my question is.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask that real quick. Okay. My question is this, because you said something about movement.
Yeah.
And you'll sometimes hear, and I have to say it's often from non-professionals, and there is truth in it, but I want to know what you think when people say, all movement is good, there's no bad movement.
I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve. It depends if you've trained for that particular movement for that goal. For example, if someone wants, hey, I'm going to go lift this, kind of ridiculously heavy object and hasn't had the training or the coaching to get it, I would probably say don't do that yet. Don't just watch a video and try to emulate that. It's not going to end very well for you. Is that going to be useful for what you have to do? That was also the other question I'm going to ask. And then, is that going to help you achieve the goal that you want to do? If I ask those criteria and they can check off those boxes, I say, okay, then go for it, try it. If they're, and it's also with respect to like, hey, do they have any limitations right now that might not work out for them very well if they don't address those first? And so it's maybe like, hey, that's a great thing and movement's great for whatever you want to do, but maybe it's no, not yet. Versus like, let's just do this right now and try to do whatever it is. And there's so many people, like the weekend warriors, for example. We have a lot of those, and unfortunately, often have very traumatic kinds of injuries. We frequently see, especially guys out there over 30 or 40. I hate to tell you this, but you're not 18 anymore,
right,
and you need to warm up.
You need, oh my God, it's so
by far the most common thing.
Yeah, it's crazy.
We have a guy who just came in yesterday. Same thing. He was just playing. He's a weekend warrior. Just picked up some basketball, which is typically where we see it, went up, and he just felt it right away. So it's a very common thing. But hey, again, it's like all moving can be good most of the time, depending what your goal is and what you want to get to. Just making sure you have the right foundation to move well on so you don't get hurt.
I love that. Yeah, I totally agree. And because I want people to move.
Yeah.
And movement, most people aren't getting enough movement. But the next layer is, most people are moving in the ways they've moved.
Yeah.
And that's habit. And sometimes then starting new movement experiences that they're not prepared for, to your point.
Yeah.
They don't know what they're, it's again, like you said,
Yeah.
we're not even given a manual for walking, much less for like lifting heavy weights and rotating and all this stuff. So I guess my point is, when you hear that, don't use that like as a flat excuse, like you never need education. For me, I have a lot of knowledge about movement, and I have a lot more to know.
Likewise.
So I'm always looking at like, I want to know more about how to move better.
Yeah.
I'm not assuming that I've got it because I know how to hip hinge well, right? So I think it is, yes, any movement, like we do want to move because versus not moving.
Yes,
but that's kind of a low bar. Move versus not move.
Right.
But if you want to move in a way that is going to be sustainable and joyful, and then layer onto that, endurance and power and all that, you do need education because most of us don't have it. Like
Absolutely.
I couldn't go into a gym, even though I'm well educated, and try and pick up a barbell and then throw it over my head like they do in a snatch, right?
Yeah.
Like I want a good trainer like you to show me how to do it. And then I can translate it probably faster than maybe somebody else because I understand my body well.
Right.
But a lot of people don't even understand their bodies well.
No, they don't.
So I'd love to then go into kind of like winterizing the body and preparing the body for any season by maybe understanding your body more. Mm-hmm. And that could be like understanding from like the brain, proprioception.
Sure. Yeah.
Understanding body mechanics, understanding like load and all those things. So how can someone who's in relatively good shape, who's listening, kind of prepare their body for any season? And I mean that literally, metaphorically. I mean like aging, all of it.
I think just knowing where you're at physically first is the biggest thing. And maybe you are in good shape, but maybe you've had a history of injuries or other kinds of things that have limited you in the past. And being aware of those things before you jump into anything in particular. The other thing is understanding that, and again, I'm in the same boat. If you're over 40, I feel you out there, especially if you're still trying to crush it. I have found that when I take classes, if there's a warm-up, I need to go 10 minutes before that warm-up, almost like a pre-warm-up, and do my own thing so I know where my limitations are, then join in a group workout or a group warm-up, and then I'm ready to go. So knowing that, listen, as you get older and the more intense the activity, especially if you're CrossFitters out there, or if you're high-intensity runners, just knowing that you just need a little more time and be forgiving to your body to be able to do those things at a high intensity by doing the proper warm up before you go. And there's lots of ways that you can warm up, whether it's doing a couple of sort of sets up at a lighter weight of the exercise or the WOD for the day for a CrossFitter. If you know you're going to have a track workout, if you're a runner out there, or a hard FTP on the bike, just knowing that before you go, just easing into that particular intense activity is going to be a good way to, quote unquote, winterize yourself for the entire year, if you will, and as you get older.
I love that. And for those of us who are not like CrossFitters or anything, how do you suggest people coming into, and I know January is always like a big time to start new things, but almost approaching like any day can be a January. Any time can be like, I'm starting like my progress. Do you have at your facilities or in your newsletters or anything, or in this check-in that you do, kind of almost a program for people who are starting off, who don't have necessarily injury, but want to improve their overall movement and kind of prehab, winterize their body for life?
Absolutely, yeah. And that actually, those are the fun clients to work with because they don't have anything restricting them. Mm-hmm. So it's like, hey, listen, I'm so glad you came in. Tell me about your activity level. Tell me about your age. Tell me about your injury or your past medical history. Tell me about your daily life, all these kinds of things, your lifestyle, so that we can actually then gear a plan towards, like, listen, based on what we're seeing in this assessment, these are things you can work on right now. And this is going to help keep you protected for the duration of, as long as you want to keep crushing it. So I think that's the main thing we try to do with those people. And it's not a set program per se because it's so individual on the person who's coming in. And it becomes like a weekly or monthly wellness check-in. Like, hey, come on in, just like you go to your primary care or to the dentist. It's the same kind of thing with physio. It's let's just make sure that you're still moving the right way. And we'll take a top-down quick screen. It just takes us a few minutes to see that, hey, you're still moving great. Keep doing what you're doing. Do you need any advice on what you're doing next so that we can guide you so you're not going to do the wrong things? Basically help people stay ahead of the game.
I love that. I feel like everybody needs this.
Yeah.
Everybody needs it. All right. So we could talk forever, but why don't you tell everybody where they can find you, how they can work with you, your website, your programs, your podcast, et cetera.
Oh, thank you. Our podcast, and thank you so much for coming on ours, is Beyond Physio. We have a YouTube channel also called Next Level Physio, which is our practice name. We have locations if you're in New Jersey, in Woodcliff Lake, New Jersey, which is in Bergen County. We also have a new office in Montclair under Adapt, powered by Next Level Physio. And then down in North Carolina, if you happen to be hollering from the south, we have an office in Cary, which is close to Raleigh. And we have an office that we're actually opening up this spring in Morrisville. That Morrisville actually is a great spot because that's where we see a lot of our triathletes because we have a pool in there. So if you're somebody struggling with swimming form or if you are needing a swim analysis, our head PT there, our director of the clinic there is John Mendenhall, and he'd be happy to take a look at what's going on. That's also where we have in Cary, Morrisville, our 3D running analysis. So if you are looking for a way to get faster before the next running season this spring, and this is probably the best time to do it because this is when people are lowering their volume, it's a good time to get that checked out before you start ramping up your miles again for the new year. Our Instagram, Next Level Physio PT. Mine is at tryjerrydpt. And email info@n as in Nancy, L, physio.com.
I love it. We'll have all that in the show notes as well. But really, you're brilliant, and I've just so enjoyed getting to know you. And again, we are pro PT. We really want our industry to thrive and not just survive, which is kind of what it's doing right now, and it's to no fault of its own, but more the way the system has formed it. But one way that you, as consumers in physical therapy and customers and clients and can help is really search out people like Jerry who are aspiring to do much more than a 15-minute allotment to help you, because when you really pay for something, especially this kind of healthcare, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck here. So I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
You're welcome. And for everybody listening, as always, I'm pulling for you.